All right, welcome everyone here tonight to this next installment of our history class on history of the Jewish people from Canaan to the Greek period, and I think I don't know what we'll do once we get to the Greek period. We'll jump off of out of the Bible and do some other things there, but certainly we'll go through to the Babylonian exile, because there's a lot of things that happen during the Babylonian exile, not in the Bible, but it's very important to our Jewish people here now today, and how we do things today is really a reflection on what was happening during the Babylonian exile. So that'll be kind of good to get onto that. So let me get one other button pushed here, and I think we'll be ready to go. All right. Let me ask: are there any questions or comments, from last week that someone might have? If there are, just the drill. You just unmute yourself and talk away. So for right now, I'm going to mute everybody just so that there's no background noise. And one other thing. Okay, I think we're ready to go. All right, let's go ahead and begin with the blessing. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who sanctifies us in his commandments and commands us to engross ourselves in words of Torah. All right, tonight's lesson, we're going to focus on the reigns of Jeroboam, and he was the king of Israel, and Rehoboam, the king of Judah. But first, I wanted to do this little slice in time and to look at one thing that okay, here's our little timelines, and those are all the same each week, so I'm not going to spend any time on that. And this was the divided kingdom. We've talked about that. That's not going to play too much into it tonight. Here's a new one, though, a new timeline that will kind of help you try to keep these different ones in the picture as to when and when all of this stuff took place, because you got Rehoboam here. Okay, now that's where the king of Judah, and you look over here and you got Jeroboam, who is the king of Israel, and the years that they were in that, and then what scriptures we're looking at for those guys, and then who the major prophet was at that time. So this is one of the better ones. It kind of puts it all in a real good frame there that you can kind of keep track of a little bit. Okay, so I wanted to do, though, our slice in time. Now, last week we talked about, well, what did they eat? And this week I'm going to tell you, well, what did they live in? How did they live? And they had typically during this time frame, anywhere in the Middle East and Europe, not Europe, Middle East and Israel and so forth, they would have what they call a pillared house. It was kind of like a little 4-room house, and in fact, it had become called an Israelite house. And it emerged there on the central highlands of Canaan during the late 13th and maybe early 12th century BCE. And the style of the house and how it was built and so forth was more of a environmental and socioeconomic need, rather than you could say, well, this is a Jewish house, but it's not. It wasn't exactly the same concept, and so it had 4 rooms generally. It could have had more, but the typical house is kind of like when we talk about in the United States, a house is 3 bedrooms and 2 baths. That's kind of the standard. You could have more, you could have less, but there was an outdoor space for cooking, or at least it wasn't in a space where all of the smoke went right back up in your house. Now, I have been in houses in Israel that were built during this time, or they were reconstructed from being built at that time. And sometimes they would have a little oven up inside a closed area, but it would still, I say closed area, it just was less open than say the cattle pens. And so here is what one of them might have looked like. You can see that. And actually these houses, that style and that plan was it was around for 600 years or so. And so um, you could look at any one of these houses. Now, it's interesting that on these houses, the roof, that was also a living area. That was a place where people would go and gather and talk. But it was interesting that in the Torah, in the law of Moses, there was an actual law that said that you had to build a parapet or a low wall up here on the roof so that people wouldn't fall over. It would have to be tall enough that they wouldn't accidentally fall over, because it said if you fell off the roof, then you were responsible for that person. And so you would have a kind of a half wall or even higher up there on the roof. And that was actually put into the Mosaic law. So it was important. And so down here, this was an area where they would keep the cattle in here. And then down here someplace they would have a cooking pit. They also had a cistern. Now that was kind of when I was looking at some of this stuff, kind of unusual that you would have a cistern there, especially considering, okay, how would they get water into this cistern? Was it a runoff from someplace? But you got all those animals in there too. So just I don't know how that really worked. I would have to do a little bit more research into that. But most of the living then was done up here on the second floor, and there were really no stairs as such. They would just use a ladder because the houses were not that large. And then, of course, then they would also have somewhere in here, they would have a ladder that would go up onto the roof. Now, this one is showing an external ladder, but here's some other artist concepts of houses and what they, the activities, the idea. These walls, this courtyard area around here was not per se it wasn't like a fortification, or it would not stop any kind of army or anything like that. That's not what it was made for. It was just to bring your animals inside at night so that they wouldn't get eaten by a lion or something like that. And there were actual lions in Israel up until about 700 AD, in fact. So that's what they're, and what now? Oh, yeah. Well, and yeah, Pat's pointed out right here that this area, see where the cow is eating out, the calf is eating out of that. Well, that's a manger. All right. So it could very well have been, the story of Christmas where the baby Jesus in the manger. Well, they could have actually been in a house like this, and there was no room up here on the second floor for them, so they had to stay down here in the courtyard, and they put him in a manger like that. That could have been. But this is stone or a type of plaster or something like that. The ones that I saw in Israel were definitely, they were just kind of a stone hollowed out piece there for to put food in for the animals. All right, and then one final picture. Here's a mock-up, or I think the term is a diorama of a house, and they've kind of got some cutaways here so that you can see what it would look like in there. And yeah, one of the ones that I was in, they had a place down in the bottom for the animals. They had some storage area, and then they did have a little oven out there. But it was more open area. I mean, it was open, but it was sheltered from the elements pretty much. But you would have the oven down here and not up here in the actual sleeping quarters, as it were. Okay. Any comments or questions on the housing there? And a lot of times what they would have would be they would have 2 or 3 generations of families living in a place like this. And in fact, they could actually build on to the outside. If there was real estate around it, they could build on to the outside. And that's why I say it could be a four room place or more as the family grew and people were to stay there. They could build around it or expand the courtyard. They were pretty flexible, but generally speaking, it wouldn't, you couldn't go up with the thing because they just really didn't have that much technology to be able to go up higher with it. So 2 stories, and then being up on the roof was just about the norm. All right. So see if there's anything else that yeah, they just said that they pull the animals up inside their fortification. It's not a fortification, inside their courtyard, just to keep the animals safe from other animals, or maybe some kind of a thief or something like that. Certainly, this would not withstand any kind of armed onslaught from an army. So then also, let's see, there was areas in the house where a woman could actually go, and during the time of her nidah, the monthly period, that she could stay in the house separated from the rest of the family, and so as not to ceremonially render the rest of the household unclean. So that was an important thing for them in that day. Other cultures dealt with that sort of thing in a different way. I can remember in the South Pacific, where during that time of the month, women would actually be segregated from the families and would live in a women's dormitory for 4 or 5 days a month. Kind of a different kind of different way of dealing with this. Okay, I got some chats. Okay. the current concept of Israeli housing does go up instead of out. Yeah, nowadays they do. They go up. There's skyscrapers all over Israel, and so that the families can stay together. You can see the chat over there. If you haven't got your chat pulled up, go ahead and pull that up, because it does have on there. Yeah, and so that is one thing over there in Israel, that if they have the roof up there and it's not finished, well, then the house is not finished. Kind of like we have something like that out here in Colorado County, where you pay taxes on your house beginning when you have your house finished. Well, we got a neighbor that he's been out here for 10, 12 years, and he still hasn't finished his house yet. So he hasn't paid the taxes on the house yet, because technically it's not finished, when you don't have any siding on the outside. So, but he lives in the house, so it's kind of funny. So yeah, then typically today, a lot of these houses, they will have a water tank up, and you see that all throughout third world countries, a water tank up on top of the roof, and so that they can pump water up in there, and with a small pump, kind of a trickle pump, and then when you do need water, it drains out of that water tank, and then in the evening or whenever you're not utilizing water, then your water pumps or whatever can pump the water up in there, and you don't have to have a lot of electricity, to pump that stuff in. All right, so anyhow, this is what it stayed like until about the time of the Babylonian exile. And then at that point, housing changed a little bit. And we'll talk about that later on, when we get to that era, that time frame. Okay. Any comments or questions on housing? Next week, I think what I'm going to do is we're going to look at the clothing that people would have worn back in those days, how it was made, what it may have looked like, and so forth. Okay, so let's go on. And I got all this information on the 4-room house from Ancient History Encyclopedia from 2014. All right, so now let's go back into our text. Now, we already know that we've seen that that Jeroboam was not a follower of God, even though it was, a prophet had told him he was going to be taking over the 10 tribes. He was not a follower of God. He set up pagan temples. He forbid the people from going to Jerusalem 3 times a year during the annual feast, for Pesach, for Rosh Hashanah, and for Sukkot. And so all he had to do was follow the Lord, and he would have been blessed. Israel would have been blessed, and so forth. But he didn't do that. And instead, he had 2 golden calves made up, one at Shechem and another one at up in Dan. And he had a temple up there in Dan, and so forth. So he just did anything and everything that he could do against God's order of things. He did. And so then in fact his type of idolatry was such that it kind of became generic in the sins of Jeroboam. And they talk about that later on in later chapters of Second Kings, first and Second Kings. So let's just look at this scripture here just a little bit to kind of set the stage. The first 3 verses of chapter 13. Unexpectedly, a man of God came from Judah to Bethel with the word of Adonai while Jeroboam was standing by the altar to burn incense. He cried out against the altar with the word of Adonai and says, "O altar, altar, thus says Adonai, behold, a son shall be born to the house of David, Josiah by name. and upon you he will sacrifice the priests of the high places who burn incense on you, and human bones will be burned upon you. The same day he gave a sign, saying, this is the sign that Adonai has spoken. The altar is about to split apart, and the fat ashes on it will be poured out. So King Jeroboam had been, he was confronted by this unnamed prophet, and there are different writers that try to come up with a name on it, and they'll say, yeah, this was this guy or that guy or whoever it was. There's about 4 or 5 different suggestions as to who it was, but there really wasn't a name. We don't know exactly who this prophet was, but he came from Judah. I thought that was kind of interesting that God would send a prophet from Judah, which is, the enemy down there for Rehoboam. That was the enemy. And the prophet then would come up and prophesy that Jeroboam was going to be he was going to be destroyed. And I was just here I am looking at my slides, and I've done this many times before, get Rehoboam and Jeroboam messed up. And so I did just on this one here. God had sent a prophet from Judah to condemn Jeroboam, okay, not Rehoboam. And then Jeroboam was offering a sacrifice as if he was a priest. And so I have a little memory hook that I use, and evidently I slipped off the hook here. Rehoboam was in the south with Judah, and I remember the Rehoboam. That's he was already royalty or a regent because his father was the king, whereas Jeroboam was not. He's just a jury-rigged king. Because he was a servant and a worker that had gotten promoted, and so he was not of the royal line, whereas Rehoboam was. Okay, so that was my memory hook to try to remember which one was which, and even with that, I messed it up. Okay, so anyway, the prophecy then was that a future king of Judah would come down and destroy that particular altar where he was offering incense. And again, there was one of those things that an altar like that, even though, I mean, the altar was unauthorized, it was not something that they should have had, but even the actions that they were doing, the altar was for sacrificing, animals, meat, that sort of thing on it, whereas the incense should have been poured out on an incense altar, something dedicated strictly for the incense, like it was in the temple in Jerusalem. So that was kind of messed up too. So Jeroboam, he's confronted by this unnamed prophet, and later on, we'll read about it in a minute. The prophet Ahiah pronounced a severe judgment on Jeroboam and his family because of Jeroboam's blatant rejection of the Lord. He said, this prophet said, I'm going to bring a disaster on the house of Jeroboam. I will cut off from Jeroboam every last male in Israel, slave or free. I will burn up the house of Jeroboam as one burns dung until it is all gone. Dogs will eat those belonging to Jeroboam who die in the city, and birds will eat those who die in the country. The Lord has spoken. All right, and you'll find that that particular prophecy then in chapter 14. So in total, Jeroboam reigned over the northern kingdom for 22 years, and then, as the Bible says, he slept with his fathers, and Nadab, his son, reigned in his place. Now, Nadab reigned over Israel for 2 years, continuing with his father's idolatry. He just kept same old. And then there was another guy in the court there, Baasha, who plotted against Nadab, assassinated him in Philistine territory. and he basically took over the throne. He usurped the throne. And as soon as Baasha began to reign, then he killed, and this is spoiler alert for future chapters, but he killed Jeroboam's whole family. He didn't leave Jeroboam anyone that breathed, but destroyed them all, according to what the Lord had said through the prophet Ahijah, the guy from Shiloh, the Shilonite. And so this bad prophecy that prophet had given, it actually came true very, very quickly within 2 years. So chapter 13 then follows with a strange tale of a faithless prophet. Now that was a kind of a strange thing here. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but it was this prophet that had come up from Judah to tell Jeroboam that he was doing badly, and God was going to punish him for that. He started heading back home. The Lord had told him, go up there, say this, and then turn right around, don't eat or drink with them, and head on back home. And so he went up there, and then he left, and then he started to just take a break. He was just lounging around on the road back, and God had told him, don't take the same road back. So he did that. He took a little different road back from Bethel, where they were at, to Jerusalem. But anyway, there was another prophet that was there in Bethel. Now they say Josephus said that this prophet was a very old man and pretty much bedridden, but for some reason Jeroboam put a lot of stock in him, and so when he heard that there was a prophet came up from Judah, then he asked, okay, where did this prophet go? Because he was thinking that he was going to lose his place as the counselor for Jeroboam. Now, again, that's not biblical. That is Josephus writing this. So, but it does kind of lay out what happened. The next, then this old prophet asked, well, where's the young guy that was up here from Judah? And they told him, well, he got on a donkey, went and found the guy and said, hey, come up here and eat dinner with me, break bread with me. The young prophet said, no, I can't do that. The Lord said for me to just get back on home, and I should not be stopping and eating and drinking up here. Why was that so important? Well, it was because of the idea that if you went into a man's house, you ate and you drank with him, then that also kind of sets up a covenant between the two of you, a covenant of certainly for the homeowner, a covenant of protection for you, the guest. And at the same time, it also would indicate that you, as the guest, agree with and are going along with the conduct of your host. And so that's why the Lord said, do not stay there and eat with those guys, because nothing that they're doing is something that I want you to participate in. So this young guy tells the old prophet, no, can't do it. God said not to. And then the old prophet told him, he said, no. I said, look, the Lord told me to chase you down out here where you're under this tree and tell you that, no, you're supposed to come up with me and eat in my place, not with the king over there, just come to my place. And so he said, well, all right. So he went there and ate and drank with the old prophet. And then the Lord spoke to the old prophet and got his attention. Now, how in the world that happened, we don't, the Bible doesn't tell us, but he went in there and the Lord spoke to this old prophet, and he said for him, he says, uh-oh. And he told the young prophet, he said, the Lord has said, because you disobeyed me, then your bones will never be buried with your ancestors. And so the guy got up and he left, and sure enough, on the way home back to Jerusalem, a lion jumped out of the rocks there, and he killed the young prophet and his donkey. and then just stayed there. The lion just stayed there. He didn't eat him. He was very well, let's see, how would you say, the lion was just standing guard over the body of the young priest, the young prophet, and the donkey, and he didn't eat him. And so people would walk by there, and they could look at it and say, okay, there's a dead guy there, and there's this lion watching over him. Okay, Mr. Lion, we're going this way. We're minding our own business. See, nothing to see here. We're leaving. And they just left the guy alone. Like, what are they going to do? They're going to go chase down a lion because the guy was dead. And so finally, it got back to the old prophet, and he said, "Oh, got to go get the guy." So he saddled up his donkey again, went and got the young prophet, put him on the donkey, and when he did that, the lion just backed off. And so, like I said, lions were seen in Israel up until about seventh century A.D. And so, anyway, they brought the young prophet's body back, and they buried him there in Bethel with the bones of the old prophet. And then the old prophet was so under conviction of what he had told the young guy, that now he knew that the young guy was right. He was a prophet of God, and so he should not have done that. And so the old prophet was very, very old anyway. He's going to die pretty soon. And so he told him, he says, look, when I die, I want you to take my bones and put them right there together with this young guy. And so that's what they ended up doing. And but the young prophet was never buried with his ancestors. All right. So then as we finish out that chapter 13, any comments or questions? Okay. All right. Going on to chapter 14, and this is a story of how that Jeroboam's son fell ill, and so Jeroboam tells his wife, look, disguise yourself, because I can't go to this prophet because he'd know who I was. Disguise yourself, go there, and here, bring a whole bunch of bread and some wine and some honey, and just all, little things, and bring it to this prophet and see if there's anything that he can do to, like, pray for our son because he's ill. And so, as it turned out, it was the same prophet that had told Jeroboam that God was going to give him the kingdom. And so that's why he thought, well, my son is sick, and this guy definitely is from the Lord. So we'll go up there and we'll put that, we'll put it before the prophet that just the Lord would heal him. So but the disguise that this woman was his wife had, it didn't work at all. Okay. And that's not surprising, because he's going to a real prophet, and the prophet could, even though the prophet he was now very old and blind, he couldn't see anything. But when the woman came in, so she didn't even have to be disguised, because he was blind, but he knew who she was, because the Lord had already told them that that's what was coming, that Jeroboam's wife was coming up there in disguise, and was going to try to get him to pray for their son. And so anyway, he then gives a very, very it's a terrible prophecy about what was going to be happening to Jeroboam, and over the period of his reign, his kingship. And, it didn't happen immediately. I mean, Jeroboam, he reigned for 22 years. But at the same time, it just was, it was going to happen. It was one of those things that no matter what they did, it was going to happen. And so, the Bible says in the scriptures here, that the prophecy the Lord had told Ahijah, that said, look, Jeroboam's wife is coming up to ask about her son. He's sick. You're to say this, that she's going to come up and ask you for that and healing. And so as soon as Ahijah heard the sound of her feet coming through the door, he says, come in, wife of Jeroboam. And says, why the disguise? But I have sent to you with a difficult message. It says, go tell Jeroboam, thus says Adonai, King of Israel, I raised you up from among the people and made you leader over my people Israel. I tore the kingdom away from the house of David and gave it to you. Yet you have not been like my servant David, who kept my commandments and followed me with all his heart, doing only what was right in my eyes. Instead, you have done more evil than all who were before you, and you have gone and made yourself other gods, molten images, just to vex me, and have cast me behind your back. Therefore, here's the prophecy. I am about to bring evil on the house of Jeroboam. I will cut off to Jeroboam even one man, bond and free, in Israel. In other words, anyone associated with the household of Jeroboam was going to be killed. I will burn up the house of Jeroboam as one burns the dung until it is gone. Anyone who belongs to Jeroboam and dies in the city, the dogs will eat. Anyone who dies in the fields, the birds of the sky will eat. For Adonai has spoken it. And as for you, arise and go to your house. As soon as you set foot in the town, the boy will die. All Israel will lament over him and bury him, for it is only him of Jeroboam's house who will be buried, because in him alone of all of Jeroboam's house something good was found toward Adonai. So evidently, the son of Jeroboam was a good person. Maybe he was just too young to have followed in his father's footsteps yet, but he had a good heart, and so the Lord said, okay, he's going to die and he will be buried honorably, but nobody else will be. And so it said, moreover, Adonai will raise up for himself a king over Israel who will cut off the house of Jeroboam that day. Now, what else? Adonai will strike Israel until it sways like a reed in the water. He will uproot Israel from this good land that he gave to the fathers, and will scatter them beyond the river, because they have made their Asherah poles, provoking Adonai. So he will give up Israel because of the sins of Jeroboam, which he committed, and caused Israel to commit. Then Jeroboam's wife got up, left, and went to Tirzah. As soon as she stepped foot over the threshold of the house, the child died. And they buried him, and all Israel lamented over him, just as was the word of Adonai that he spoke through his servant Ahijah the prophet. So that prophecy that he gave, that's a tough prophecy. And as it turns out, you read the next few lines in the chapter, and it says, and Jeroboam died and slept with his fathers. We find out then in chapter 14, which we'll look at next week, that exactly what did happen to the rest of the people in Jeroboam's family. Now, at this point, we see that the narrative shifts back to Rehoboam in Judah, and you'll see that in First Kings and Second Kings, and then also in Chronicles, Second Chronicles, where they will shift back and forth. The story goes back and forth between Judah and Israel. So sometimes it's a little confusing as to figure out, okay, who is who and who's what here. So anyhow, any comments or questions so far at this point? All right. So we look at 1 Kings 14, and let me get back over here where this line is. 1 Kings 14, 21 to 24. Meanwhile, Rehoboam, son of Solomon, reigned in Judah. Rehoboam was 41 years old when he became king, and he reigned 17 years in Jerusalem, the city where Adonai had chosen out of all of the tribes of Israel to put his name. His mother's name was Naamah the Ammonitess, and Judah did what was evil in Adonai's sight. They provoked him to jealousy with more than all of their forefathers had done with the sins that they committed. They also built for themselves high places, sacred pillars, and Asherah poles on every high hill and under every leafy tree. And there were also male cult prostitutes in the land. They did the same abominations as those of the nations that Adonai had driven out before the children of Israel. So that's just talking about what Rehoboam did, kind of nasty stuff. And so he was ungodly. He was not one that followed after his grandfather David. And Rehoboam, he was think now this is the grandson of David. He was like, really, he knew David. David knew him. He held him and so forth. So you would think that maybe some of that might have passed down a little bit, but it didn't. He promoted all of those the Canaanite gods, and they built, all sorts of temples and high places and Asherah poles and those kind of things. And so the Lord, pretty much had enough of it. So chapter 12 then talks about how he was punished. And so we'll look at chapter 12. So now it came to pass when the kingdom of Rehoboam was established and he became strong, that he and all of Israel with him forsook the Torah of Adonai. It so happened that in the 5th year of Rehoboam, King Shishak of Egypt marched against Jerusalem, because they had been unfaithful to Adonai. With 1,200 chariots, 60,000 horsemen, and innumerable troops that came with him from Egypt, Libyans, Sukkites, and Cushites. Those would be mercenary soldiers. And he captured the fortified cities of Judah and came as far as Jerusalem. Then Shemaiah the prophet came to Rehoboam and the officers of Judah who had gathered in Jerusalem because of Shishak, and said to them, "Thus says Adonai, you have abandoned me, so I also have abandoned you to the hand of Shishak." And then the officers of Israel and the king humbled themselves and said, "Adonai is great," and that's kind of like a repentance there. And when Adonai saw that they had humbled themselves, the word of Adonai came to Shemaiah, saying, "They have humbled themselves. I will not destroy them, but grant them some measure of deliverance. And my wrath will not be poured out upon Jerusalem by the hand of Shishak. However, they will become subjects to him, so that they may learn the difference between serving me and serving the kings of the earth." So there again, that's one of those deals where these guys cried out, they humbled themselves, and God said, okay, good. I will just withhold the punishment, the full punishment, and see how you do. God it seemed like he always had mercy on these people, and just would give them one more shot. And so that's encouraging to me, that God would be merciful to those guys, and so he wouldn't wouldn't completely destroy them, because how many of us today are perfect? Anybody out there? Okay, no, I'm not, and I doubt very seriously if you are too. And so you are either. Yeah, my grammarian over here is helping me with that. Um, so even though we're not perfect, God still has mercy on us. Very, very thankful for that. So then one of the things that we had seen here is that uh, Shishak, he came up there and he attacked Israel. Well, Israel hadn't been attacked, or the Judah, that part of Israel, had not been attacked for the what 40 years of Solomon, and so and even before that for a while with David. So I mean, there was maybe 50 years or so that Judah had never been attacked by a foreign power, and so this was really, really tough for them. There were people there that had never seen war, and God sent Shishak as a punishment. And there was I'll show you some pictures here shortly of the cities that Rehoboam had fortified. He fortified a whole bunch of cities, and you'll notice that the cities. Let's go ahead and look at those now, because I'm jumping out of my zone here. these cities, you'll see the ones in gray. Those were the ones that were fortified by Rehoboam, and then the ones in black had been fortified by Solomon. And you'll see the ones that are fortified by Rehoboam were all to the west and to the south. So that's where he figured his enemies would come from. And then, as it turned out, it didn't help a bit, because Shishak went right up through here, and all of these cities, it's got a number on them. Well, he took all of those cities, and then he went back, and they put at one of the buildings in Karnak, they had this wall, and he lists that when on this foray, Shishak had gone through, and he had captured an overrun anyway, 187 cities. All right, now not all of those were uh, Judean cities. He went further to the east over there and took a bunch of places, but he did take those Israel, the Judean cities, and pretty much went through, took anything of value that he wanted. He went into the temple, and they just basically gutted the temple. Remember that David and Solomon had made these gold shields, for decorations. Well, they took all those gold shields, and then now Rehoboam had to come in and try to replace them, and he didn't have the gold to do that anymore. So they did it with bronze, quite a cheap substitute. And even then, they didn't keep them out on display. They said that they would only come out when the king was there, and then as soon as the king left, they would take those shields and go and put them away in a storage place so nobody could get them, even though they were just bronze and not gold. So Shishak went up through there, and he just basically took whatever he wanted. And all of those cities went as far up, even into he went even up into Israel. He didn't restrict it just to Judah. He went all the way up into Israel. All right. So, but then I think that's pretty much. He took away the shields and took a bunch of gold out of the things out of the temple. So, really did do a number on that. So, All that, all those fortifications that Rehoboam had done were really for naught, because when God sends somebody to punish you, you might as well just go ahead and take it, because you know, all of the armies in the world are not going to be able to cover you if you're again going against God. And He says, "I've had enough of your foolishness." So um, ultimately, after Rehoboam had, he became established down there in that southern kingdom. He abandoned the ways of God. Now for 3 years they kind of did okay, all right, and they followed the Lord, but then they just fell off the wagon, and um, see, Rehoboam went headlong into idolatry and all the things that Jeroboam was doing in the north. Well, Rehoboam was doing on the south, and it was like both of them looking at each other and saying, "Hold my beer and watch this." And see, and they built all of these temples and high places and so forth. The one thing that Rehoboam did not do is appoint priests like Jeroboam did, because a lot of the priests, and I would say most of the priests, then moved down to Jerusalem and served the Lord, because they could not go along with Jeroboam and his idolatry. So most of them did. There were some that did not, but I mean, like, look at this old guy, old prophet, because you would think that he would have been a priest too. Um, so I think that just pretty much uh, finishes us off tonight, because it said after that, um, then Rehoboam, he passed away, and he was, said, slept with his fathers.